Hello, young scholars. This is Mr. Martyron with your Flip Classroom on classical Greek culture. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at the Parthenon. We're going to take a look at qualities of Greek sculptures. We're going to take a look at what we call Greeks 3.0, entertainment, mathematics, history, and athletics. And we're also going to take a look at advances in mathematics. So let's take a trip to Athens, Greece. Let's plant ourselves on the Attican Peninsula, where we'll visit the Acropolis, and we'll climb up the Acropolis, sitting atop of it, and we'll see the Parthenon. And now let's take a journey back to 447 BCE, when Greece has thwarted the Persian invasion and enters what's known as its Golden Age. This is where we see the advancements in drama and philosophy and literature and architecture, and it was second to none. The city's empire stretched from the western Mediterranean to the Black Sea, creating enormous wealth. And that wealth paid for one of the biggest public works projects ever seen in Greek history. And that was the Parthenon. The temple known as the Parthenon was built on the Acropolis between 447 and 438 BCE, and it was part of a vast building program masterminded by the Athenian statesman Pericles. Inside the temple stood a colossal statue representing Athenia, the patron goddess of the city. The statue, which no longer exists, was made of gold and ivory. The Parthenon represented the coming together of math and science and art. Triangular pediments sat atop of the Parthenon, capturing the viewer's attention, while within the Parthenon, three-dimensional art known as frescoes and friezes were painted and sculpted in order to depict ancient Greek battles and victories. No other structure dominated Greek life like the Parthenon. During this time, Greeks also developed three new columns. Now, this might seem unimportant to the casual observer, but these columns tell us a lot about Greek and how the Greeks developed during this time period. You could build a simple Doric column with a flat top, very unceremonially, or we've seen advancements into more Ionic columns with frills at the top, or more elaborate structures like Corinthian columns. And we see these columns represented in buildings all over the world and in the United States today. We see these columns represented in monuments and memorials in Washington, D.C., and in the Capitol building. And historians are constantly making comparisons between the birthplace of democracy in Athens and the American Republic and its capital in Washington, D.C., both in style, substance, and architecture. During the Golden Age of Greece, Greeks were obsessed with the human form and what the ideal human should look like. This is reflected in the art and statues that we see from this time period, and it's also reflected in what historians have observed as amphora or pottery that's from this time period. And truthfully, no other sculpture is more important than that of a sculpture named Kredos Boy. Constructed in 480 BCE, Kredos Boy does something that no other statue up to this point has ever done. By a close examination of Kredos Boy, we can see that he demonstrates an Italian term called contrapposto. Contrapposto means a natural shifting in weight. In essence, Kredos Boy is taking a step forward, and that may not seem like a lot to you, but by taking one step forward, you're showing a natural shift in your weight. By taking a step forward, Kredos Boy is showing movement. Statues prior to this period showed a stationary person, or god. Kredos Boy is showing movement. And in order to show movement, the muscles and bones must flex and move, and that requires the artist to have an in-depth knowledge and understanding of human anatomy and the human body. Kredos Boy will go on to pave the way for other famous sculptures, including that of the late Renaissance piece by Michelangelo, the Statue of David. Other artistic developments that happened during this time period is the development of wet cloth drapery. Again, this requires a lot of skill from the artist as they chisel marble and stone and sand it down to create the illusion of cloth or clothing that is casually draped over an individual. This wet cloth drapery naturally shows how clothing would sit and rest on a person. In addition to the fine arts, we also see advancements in athletics and the performing arts. During the Golden Age, we see developments of two types of plays. We see comedies and tragedies. Typically, the Greek tragedy involved a hero struggling against insurmountable odds, and oftentimes the outcome was not in our hero's favor. The Greeks also used the use of irony as a way of conveying meaning throughout their plays. Greeks also developed the comedy, and these were light-hearted, humorous plays that typically had happier endings, also using the use of irony to illustrate their comedy. And finally, in 776 BC, we see evidence that the first Olympic Games were played. And take a guess what the first sports were? Well, you've got it, running. Some of the first races included a 200 and 400 meter foot races. There was jumping, discus throwing, wrestling, boxing, and of course horse racing and chariot racing. The Olympics were held for nearly 12 centuries until Emperor Theodosius banned them in 393 because he believed they were part of a pagan ritual. Not only were there advancements in the Golden Age of Greece made in the arts and architecture and literature, but also in math and science. So let's take a look at three very important mathematicians and scientists. The first is Thucydides, and he was the first person to examine historical information and refuse to accept supernatural explanations as fact. This was important because it represents one of the first times that people begin to start looking at patterns for developing different theories and ideas about how the world and the universe work. Then, of course, we have Pythagoras, and he's attempting to explain the world in mathematical terms. He also explored whole numbers, geometry, and ratios. And what's interesting about mathematics during this time period is the number 0. There's evidence that the Greeks did not use 0 as a numeric number, but rather as a placeholder. Indian empires, on the other hand, actually used 0 as a number. And it wasn't until the Arab empires began trading with India that the idea for 0 being used as a number, not a placeholder, made its way into Greek culture and then later European culture. And the final Greek scientist or mathematician we're going to take a look at is Hippocrates. Hippocrates may be known as one of the earliest doctors, and he believed that diseases had a natural cause and they were not caused by the supernatural beings. He believed that the human body could be cured of ailments. And again, this is a time when a lot of people didn't understand diseases and viruses. So Hippocrates is looking at sick people and looking for patterns of the sickness and the disease. And he is making the argument that it is not God's punishment, but rather something that can be explained logically.